Close your eyes for a moment and picture the Wild West as you've so often seen it on the silver screen. The sun is sinking low, turning the horizon into a river of gold and fire. A lone rider moves across the dusty plains, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over steady eyes. Behind him, the land stretches endlessly open, free, untouched. A place where the rules of the old world no longer bind you. Where a person might truly become whoever they wish to be. You might hear the faint twang of a guitar in your imagination. A mournful ballad drifting on the breeze. In town, there's the clink of glasses and laughter spilling from the saloon doors, where polished boots stamp on wooden floors to the rhythm of a fiddle. Cowboys lean against hitching posts, exchanging easy words, while the sheriff keeps a watchful but calm eye. On the street, it is the dream of freedom, the dream of the frontier. A place where courage and grit alone can turn anyone into a legend. This dream has been carried across generations through dime novels, Hollywood westerns, and bedtime tales whispered to children. It is a land of adventure, of justice served. From the barrel of a gun, of dusty trails and heroic duels at high noon. But dreams, as you know, can be deceiving. For behind the romance of campfires and cowboy songs lay a world of merciless struggle. The West was vast, yes, but it was also unforgiving. It was beautiful, yet brutal, and if you, transported by some twist of fate, were to wake up one morning in that distant land, well, the truth is, you might not survive even a single day. The story we are about to unfold is not the polished dream of the frontier, but the reality harsh, relentless, and unyielding. So, draw your blanket a little closer, settle in, and let us begin. The Wild West awaits you, but it may not welcome you kindly. Imagine this. You open your eyes, and instead of your familiar room, you find yourself lying on a rough bed of straw, covered by a blanket that smells faintly of dust, wood smoke, and horses. The air is cool, almost biting, and as you sit up, you notice the thin cracks in the walls of the shack you've apparently slept in. Through them, pale shafts of dawn light creep in, illuminating floating motes of dust. Outside a rooster crows, but the sound is not followed by the hum of traffic, nor the distant buzz of electricity. There is only silence, broken now and then by the creak of wood or the stamping of hooves in the dirt. This is not a dream. This is the Wild West. You stumble outside, the ground uneven beneath your feet. A breeze cuts across the open plains, carrying with it the smell of dry grass, smoke from last night's campfire, and something else, something faintly sour that reminds you of animals penned too close together. There are no paved roads, no streetlights, no shops where you can wander in for a morning coffee. Just dirt tracks that stretch toward the horizon, scattered with wagon ruts and hoofprints. Around you stand a few rough buildings, their walls made of timber and mud. Leaning slightly with age and weather, your throat is dry. You realize you have no water bottle, no phone, no watch. Just the clothes on your back, the strange silence of this place, and the growing awareness that every hour ahead of you will demand something you don't yet know how to give. One day that is all you have to survive. One day in the Wild West, and already the odds are against you. The first rays of sunlight creep across the horizon, painting the land in muted shades of gold and gray. At first, the sight is breathtaking, the kind of beauty you might expect to find on a postcard. Wide skies, endless grass, a horizon that seems to go on forever. But beauty can be misleading. The morning air is sharp, colder than you'd expect. Out here, without modern insulation, dawn often means shivering through the chill left behind by the desert night. Your breath escapes in thin clouds, and your fingers ache as you rub them together for warmth. The fire from last night has long since burned out, leaving only gray ash and a few blackened stones. You look around for something familiar, something to hold on to, but there is nothing. No houses with windows glowing in the early morning. No voices of neighbors starting their day. No paved roads stretching ahead with the promise of safe passage. Only dirt, scattered sagebrush, and the haunting cry of a bird circling above. Hunger stirs in your stomach. Your throat is dry. Already, your body is reminding you of needs that, here in this place, cannot be met with ease. In the Wild West, the day begins not with comfort, but with questions of survival. Where will you find water? What will you eat? And how far can your feet carry you before the sun climbs high and the real heat of the plains begins its work? The light of dawn may look gentle, but out here, it is the signal of a long and merciless day ahead. Step forward, and the land stretches on without end. At first, it seems magnificent, the kind of view that might inspire freedom, a boundless world with no walls to contain you. The horizon glimmers faintly under the rising sun, miles upon miles of grassland, broken only by the distant shape of hills and the faint shimmer of heat beginning to rise. But the longer you stand and stare, the more unsettling it becomes. There are no markers here, no signs to guide you, no familiar landmarks to keep your bearings. The landscape repeats itself, endlessly rolling plains, dusty trails, patches of brush and rock. Turn one way, and the scene looks much the same as when you turn the other. Out here, the earth can play tricks on your mind. For those who truly lived in the West, this was one of the greatest challenges. Direction. Without a compass, without a map, a traveler could be swallowed whole by the openness. Walk too far from a trail, and within an hour the world around you begins to look identical. The line between north and south, east and west, blurs into a confusion that can lead to deadly mistakes. And then there is the silence. No distant engines humming, no power lines buzzing, no crowds, no comfort in numbers. Only the low whistle of the wind, and sometimes the far-off howl of a coyote. The kind of silence that makes you realize how small you are in this world, and how alone to wander across these endless horizons is to tempt fate. Every mile you walk carries the weight of uncertainty. Will the land lead you to water, or to nothing but dust? Will it carry you closer to safety, or farther from it? The open plains of the Wild West may look like freedom in the stories. But when you are standing in the middle of them, without a path, without supplies, and without certainty, they feel less like freedom, and more like a trap. As the sun climbs higher, the chill of dawn vanishes, replaced by something far more dangerous. The air grows heavy, the sky sharpening into a pale, merciless blue. There are no trees to offer shade, no walls to block the glare. The plains and deserts of the Wild West were places of extremes, cold in the night and by day. Blistering heat that baked the ground until it cracked, your lips begin to dry. Sweat beads on your forehead, but instead of cooling you, it evaporates almost instantly in the dry air. Out here, the body loses water faster than you realize. A few hours beneath this sun can leave a traveler dizzy, weak, and staggering without warning. Many who set out unprepared discovered that dehydration strikes not with a gentle warning, but like a thief, sudden, merciless, and swift. Then there is the dust. Every step you take stirs it from the ground. Fine particles that cling to your clothes, your skin, your lungs. It scratches at your throat with every breath, coating your tongue, making thirst burn even more sharply. A gust of wind does not clear it. Instead, it lifts the dust higher, turning the air into a swirling haze. For those on wagon trains or driving cattle, it was worse still. Clouds of dust rose from hundreds of hooves and wheels, choking travelers for miles. Eyes watered, lungs strained, and every mouthful of food tasted of grit. Men and women arrived at camps each evening with their skin turned the color of the earth, their lungs aching from the constant storm they carried with them. The stories of the West often show the cowboy silhouetted against a blazing sky, calm and heroic beneath the sun. But in truth, that same sun was often his deadliest enemy. For the land here was not gentle, not forgiving, and every particle of dust was a reminder that nature ruled, and humans survived only if they were very lucky. Before long, the dryness in your mouth becomes unbearable. Your lips crack, your tongue feels thick, and every swallow is a struggle. Out here in the Wild West, thirst was not just discomfort, it was the shadow of death. Water, the simplest thing in your modern life, was the most uncertain treasure on the frontier. Rivers and streams existed, yes, but they were few and often far between. Some dried up entirely under the summer sun. Others ran foul with mud, animal waste, or the invisible germs that carried sickness. A sip from the wrong stream could bring dysentery or cholera, illnesses that drained the body faster than any drought. For settlers crossing the plains, the question of water haunted every mile. Wells dug by hand sometimes struck nothing but dry earth. Rain barrels sat empty for weeks on end. And in places like the deserts of New Mexico, Arizona, or Nevada, waterholes could be 30 miles apart or more. Imagine walking that distance, in blistering heat, carrying no canteen, with dust rising at every step. Animals needed water, to oxen pulling wagons, horses carrying riders, cattle driven across hundreds of miles. They drank gallons each day. If water could not be found for them, entire journeys ended in failure. There are countless accounts of wagon trains stranded beside the bleached bones of their livestock. Travelers reduced to walking beneath the scorching sky with little hope of reaching safety. Some tried desperate measures, digging into dry creek beds, licking dew from rocks, or sipping stagnant puddles filled with insects. Others learned from indigenous guides, who knew hidden springs and desert plants that could be tapped for moisture. But for most newcomers to the West, thirst was an enemy they never fully defeated. Even if you find a small pool now, are you brave enough to drink it? Brave enough to risk disease? Or too thirsty to care? In the Wild West, survival often meant gambling with your own body, and thirst was a wager many did not win. As you continue your journey across the plains, the land begins to feel alive in ways that are not always comforting. The Wild West was full of creatures that watched, hunted, and sometimes attacked without warning. Wolves roamed in packs, following trails and moving silently beneath the trees. Coyotes scavenged near waterholes and campsites, often bold enough to snatch a chicken or worse if you weren't careful. Snakes, some harmless, some venomous, slithered through the tall grass and rocks, ready to strike at the unwary. Even small animals carried risks, from raccoons to rodents, which could bite, scratch, or carry disease. But it wasn't just the large predators that made survival difficult. The insects alone could drive a person to despair. Clouds of mosquitoes, gnats, and biting flies descended without warning. In the summer heat, horseflies and horse-botflies would swarm around anyone near animals. Their bites weren't just painful, could infect wounds, spread disease, or simply sap your energy with relentless irritation. And imagine the nights. While you try to rest by a campfire, the sounds of the wilderness surround you. The howl of distant predators keeps your senses alert. The rustle of unseen creatures in the brush hints at life that doesn't mean you well. And all the while, tiny pests crawl into your hair, your clothing, your bedding, turning sleep into a challenge. For settlers and travelers, animals weren't just background scenery, they were daily threats. A careless step could mean a rattlesnake bite. A poorly protected camp could lead to a nocturnal raid by coyotes or wolves. And the endless swarm of insects was enough to make even the hardiest pioneers long for the controlled discomforts of home. In this land, survival was not about heroism alone. It was about vigilance, caution, and understanding that danger often came in small, silent, and unexpected forms. The West may look open and free, but it watches you closely and it waits. Imagine yourself in a long line of wagons, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. Each vehicle is loaded with all a family-owned supplies, tools, belongings, hopes for a new life. The journey is slow, exhausting, and unforgiving. Wagons creak and groan with every mile, wooden wheels digging into dirt ruts or sinking into soft mud. Oxen strain under heavy loads, their hooves pounding the earth, muscles trembling with the effort. Dust rises in thick clouds behind each wagon, coating faces, clothes, and eyes. Every breath tastes of grit, and every step feels heavier than the last. Travelers endured days without proper sleep, waking at dawn to harness the animals, repair broken wheels, or fetch water from distant sources. Meals are sparse, often cold or overcooked. Children march alongside barefoot or in worn boots, learning quickly that complaining does little to ease their suffering. Illness spreads like wildfire. A single sick child can bring despair to an entire wagon train. Dysentery, cholera, and fever claim more lives than accidents, leaving families to bury their loved ones hastily along the trail. There are no cemeteries, only rough graves marked by a simple pile of stones. Accidents are constant. Wheels break, axles snap, or animals stumble. One wrong step can leave a wagon overturned, supplies scattered, and hopes for survival dwindling. In the wilderness, help is not around the corner. Every mile traveled is a test of endurance, patience, and sheer luck. Despite the hardship, people keep moving, driven by dreams of land, gold, or freedom. But for many, the journey itself becomes a daily battle. A relentless grind where exhaustion and danger are companions at every step. The romantic image of a wagon train, with cheerful pioneers laughing along the trail, hides the truth. Crossing the West was a daily fight for life, and the land was indifferent to those who dared to challenge it. The horizon ahead is no longer just dry plains, it is interrupted by a river, winding and unpredictable. For travelers in the Wild West, a river could be both a lifeline and a lethal barrier. Crossing it was never simple. Some rivers were shallow, wide, and calm, offering a chance to wade through. Others were swollen from snowmelt or sudden storms, churning with icy currents strong enough to sweep away people, wagons, and livestock. One misjudged step, one sudden surge, and hours of progress could vanish in an instant. Wagons had to be carefully guided, wheels sometimes lashed together or reinforced with makeshift rafts. Oxen and horses struggled to find footing on slippery rocks, their panicked movements threatening to capsize the vehicle. Families clung to one another, shouting instructions, trying to keep both animals and children from being carried away. Some crossings required ferries or flatboats, if such aids existed at all. Fees were steep, patience was tested, and delays could last days, leaving travelers exposed to heat, cold, and disease. In more remote areas, there was no assistance at all. Crossings had to be improvised, and improvisation often led to tragedy. Stories abound of wagons tipped by unseen currents, livestock lost, and lives drowned in waters that looked gentle from the bank. The river did not care about dreams of new lands or promises of gold. It demanded respect, careful planning, and sometimes luck beyond measure. Even when safely across, travelers were marked by the ordeal, soaked, chilled, and exhausted. Every crossing reminded them that nature in the West was not a backdrop for adventure. It was a force to be reckoned with, unforgiving and absolute. Crossing rivers was not merely a part of the journey. It was a test of skill, courage, and survival. One wrong decision, one unexpected surge, could end a day or a life without warning. Beyond the plains, the land rises. Mountains loom on the horizon, jagged silhouettes cutting sharply against the sky. To settlers and travelers, these peaks were both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevada were beautiful from a distance, but up close, they were obstacles few could easily overcome. Steep inclines tested the endurance of both people and animals. Wagons had to be carefully guided along narrow, rocky trails, their wheels scraping against stone and their axles straining with the weight of supplies. Oxen stumbled, sometimes fatally, and horses slipped on slick rocks or hidden patches of mud. Every step demanded caution, yet even the most careful travelers could be undone by an unexpected rockslide or sudden storm. Weather in the mountains was unpredictable. A warm morning could transform into a freezing afternoon with hail, snow, or icy winds that cut through wool and leather. Hypothermia claimed more lives than one might imagine, as travelers were often soaked from rain or sweating from labor, then chilled by wind at higher altitudes. Food and water became scarce. Streams ran cold and fast, difficult to reach without risking a fall, and edible plants were few. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, and exhaustion was constant. Some settlers carried heavy packs up narrow passes, only to reach the summit and find the next valley just as unforgiving. For those unprepared or unlucky, the mountains were more than a barrier, they were a graveyard. Entire families succumbed. to exposure, disease, or sheer exhaustion, leaving only the mountains' silence to mark their passing. To cross the mountains was to confront one of the West's greatest tests. They demanded resilience, knowledge, and determination beyond ordinary human limits. Many never made it, and those who did emerged not triumphant, but battered, weary, and forever changed by the ordeal. The mountains were majestic, but in the Wild West, majesty could kill. Beyond the mountains, the land flattens, stretches, and transforms into desert. Endless dunes, sun-baked plains, and sparse vegetation replace the rivers and forests of earlier terrain. To the unprepared, it is a silent, merciless expanse. The desert tests both body and mind. The sun beats down relentlessly, baking the earth and turning every step into labor. Heat radiates from sand and rock, reflecting in waves that blur the horizon and twist your sense of distance. Water is scarce, and the few streams or springs are often hidden or contaminated. Travelers who drink without caution risk illness. Those who abstain risk collapse. Navigation is another challenge. Landmarks are rare, and without clear trails, one can wander for hours or days without realizing it. Even experienced guides sometimes became disoriented, victims of mirages or shifting sands that made the landscape seem unfamiliar. Animals, too, are a threat. Venomous snakes slither silently across the sand. Coyotes hunt in the cooler hours of dawn and dusk. Insects swarm where moisture exists, and scorpions hide under rocks, waiting for the unwary. At night, temperatures plummet. What burned during the day freezes during the dark hours, exposing travelers to hypothermia after surviving the scorching sun. The desert does not forgive mistakes, and many who entered alone or unprepared never returned. Stories of lost wagon trains, exhausted cattle drives, and stranded prospectors litter the deserts of New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. Those who survived did so through skill, luck, or guidance from those who had lived there their whole lives, often indigenous peoples, who knew the hidden springs and desert plants that sustained life. To walk these deserts is to confront solitude, thirst, and relentless heat. It is to realize how small and fragile human life truly is when the earth itself turns indifferent. The desert seems endless, and in many ways it is, and for those who wander without care, it is also deadly. Hunger arrives quietly, then grows into a gnawing companion you cannot ignore. On the frontier, food was never abundant, and what you had often teetered on the edge of spoilage. Settlers and travelers relied on staples that could endure the long, unpredictable journey: flour, salted or dried meat, beans, and whatever grains could be carried in barrels or sacks. Fresh produce was a luxury, disappearing quickly in the heat and dust of the plains. Meals were simple, repetitive, and often barely nourishing. Cooking itself was a challenge. Fires were fickle in dry, windy conditions, and the tools were primitive. A cast iron skillet over a smoky flame or a pot dangling from a tripod was all that stood between you and raw, inedible food. Burnt beans, overcooked meat, or scalded coffee were the norm. Mistakes could ruin your meager supplies for days. Food scarcity wasn't just inconvenient, was dangerous. Weak bodies were more susceptible to disease, fatigue, and injury. Travelers sometimes traded supplies for a few fresh eggs or a piece of cheese, but scarcity often bred desperation. Some even risked hunting wild animals that could carry disease or be difficult to kill. Salted meat, known as jerky or biltong, was common, but it carried its own hazards. If improperly cured or stored, it could harbor bacteria that caused illness. Flour could become infested with weevils. Beans could swell and spoil in the heat. Every meal was a gamble between survival and sickness. Children too felt the strain. Their small bodies demanded calories, but they were given the same rationed meals as adults. Weakness, crankiness, and illness were constant companions on the frontier table. In the stories of the West, settlers may sit under a tree, enjoying a hearty meal after a long day. In truth, hunger shadowed every step, every mile, and every sunrise. Survival depended not only on courage and endurance, but on the rare, precious provision of food that could sustain life just long enough to face the next challenge. On the frontier, preparing a meal was never a simple task. There were no modern stoves, no ovens, and no easy way to boil water safely. Instead, you relied on an open fire, a cast-iron pot, and whatever tools you could carry. Building a fire was its own challenge. Wind could scatter sparks, rain could dampen kindling, and finding dry wood in some areas was nearly impossible. Even when a fire burned, it provided more smoke than warmth, stinging eyes and covering clothing in soot. Once the fire was going, the act of cooking required constant vigilance. Meat could burn on one side while remaining raw on the other. Water for coffee or beans could boil over and vanish in the dry air, leaving you with nothing. Pots and pans were heavy, crude, and often cracked. Food contaminated by dirt or dust from the wind could make you sick. Every meal was a negotiation with the environment. Wild animals lurked nearby, attracted by the smell of cooking. Insects swarmed relentlessly. Even simple tasks, like frying bacon or boiling potatoes, demanded skill, patience, and a careful eye. One misstep could mean not just ruined food, but illness or worse. For families traveling in wagons, cooking was a shared labor. Children and adults alike gathered firewood, hauled water, and tended the flames. A meal might be ready only after hours of preparation, leaving everyone tired before they even began to eat. Yet, despite all these difficulties, food remained the most crucial element of survival. Every bite was a battle against hunger, heat, and the unpredictability of the land. To eat in the Wild West was to fight for life, meal by meal, fire by fire. As the sun climbs high and the wind rises, you realize that your shelter is as fragile as the world around you. On the frontier, homes were often little more than sticks, mud, or stretched canvas. They offered a thin barrier against the elements, barely enough to keep out cold rain or the relentless sun. Wagons were sometimes converted into temporary homes, their canvas covers ripped and patched again and again. Log cabins, where they existed, were crude constructions, with gaps between the logs that allowed wind, dust, and insects to slip inside. Roofs leaked when it rained. Floors were rough, uneven, and cold beneath bare feet. At night, these shelters offered little comfort. The wind whistled through cracks, carrying the distant calls of predators. Rain could turn the ground into mud, flooding your sleeping area and soaking your bedding. Heat in summer trapped you inside suffocating tents or cabins that acted like ovens. Even inside, danger persisted. Snakes, scorpions, and insects could find their way into the smallest cracks. Mice and rats scavenged for food, spreading disease. The very shelter meant to protect you was fragile, temporary, and never entirely safe. For settlers, building and maintaining a home was a daily struggle. It required constant labor, skill, and an understanding that nothing built here was permanent. The land could, and often did, destroy human efforts in a single night through storms, floods, fire, or neglect. Shelter in the Wild West was a fragile promise. It offered a semblance of safety, but survival depended on constant vigilance, ingenuity, and acceptance of the land's relentless whims. On the frontier, life was raw, and the conveniences of modern hygiene were all but non-existent. Outhouses were often little more than a hole in the ground, sometimes a wooden box perched above it. They were placed a short distance from the home, in full view of the wind, dust, and curious eyes. Using one was never pleasant. Flies swarmed relentlessly, drawn to the stench. Rain turned the paths into slick mud, while sun baked the odor into the very air. At night, reaching the outhouse could be dangerous. Wild animals, snakes, or even bandits might lurk in the darkness. Sanitation, or the lack of it, was one of the deadliest aspects of frontier life. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera spread quickly in camps and small settlements. A single contaminated water source or careless disposal of waste could infect an entire wagon train. Mothers and children, already weakened by hunger and exposure, were most vulnerable. Hand washing was rare, soap was precious, clothes were seldom cleaned, and lice and fleas thrived in the cramped quarters of tents and cabins. The very act of living created conditions that modern cities would consider unbearable. The stories of the West rarely mention these realities, but for those who lived it, every trip to the outhouse, every poorly washed meal, and every exposure to the elements carried the risk of sickness. Death was never far behind, and survival demanded constant attention, not just to hunger and thirst, but to the invisible enemies that crept in through neglect, dust, and filth. Sanitation was not a matter of comfort, it was a matter of life and death. Step into a town, and the first thing you notice may be the wide, dusty main street, lined with wooden buildings swaying slightly in the wind. But look closer, and the absence of order becomes clear. In much of the Wild West, law enforcement was scarce or non-existent. A single sheriff might preside over dozens of square miles, often riding alone and armed only with a six-shooter. Deputies were few, and their authority limited. Beyond the town's center, there was nothing but open land, where rules were written, not on paper, but by whoever carried the most firepower. Crime was common, and it could strike anywhere. Horses were stolen from open corrals. Shops were robbed with little consequence. Disputes over land, water, or cattle were settled not in courts, but with fists or bullets. Travelers unarmed, or inexperienced, learned quickly that relying on law or luck was dangerous. Some towns relied on vigilance committees, groups of citizens taking the law into their own hands. Justice was swift, often brutal, and occasionally mistaken. Lynching and mob punishment were part of the reality, leaving fear and distrust to dominate daily life. Even the presence of a sheriff offered little comfort. Many had reputations for corruption, partiality, or incompetence. You could be threatened, robbed, or cheated, and the nearest authority capable of helping might be days away. The Wild West was, at its heart, a land where survival often depended on your own wits, strength, and courage. Law was a fragile thing, stretched thin across vast and unforgiving terrain. For newcomers or the unprepared, the absence of protection turned the simplest encounter into a potential threat in this land. You quickly learn that caution, vigilance, and the ability to defend yourself are not just virtues, they are necessities for survival. Movies often show the Wild West as a place of constant gunfights, duels at high noon with dramatic standoffs. The truth, however, is both more dangerous and more mundane. Guns were everywhere. Almost every adult male carried a revolver or rifle, not for show, but because danger was constant. Bandits, rustlers, and disputes over property or pride meant a firearm was a necessity, not a fashion statement. Accidental discharges, negligent handling, and drunken confrontations were far more common than choreographed duels. Shootouts did occur, but they were rarely dramatic. Bullets flew unpredictably, often striking the wrong person or missing entirely. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire, and wounds that might be minor today were often fatal due to the lack of medical care. Carrying a gun, also, brought responsibility. Every encounter required split-second decisions, and hesitation could mean death. Many who thought themselves brave were unprepared for the physical and psychological strain of using a firearm. Under pressure, even towns with a peaceful reputation were tense. People watched each other constantly, aware that a verbal disagreement could escalate to violence within seconds. The Wild West was not lawless in the sense of chaos. It was lawless because survival demanded readiness for danger at every turn. So while the legends of heroic gunfighters persist, the reality is grimmer. Guns were tools for survival, and survival depended on skill, awareness, and often sheer luck. One mistake could end your day or your life instantly. The open roads of the Wild West were not safe. Between towns, trails, and river crossings, bandits and outlaws lurked, waiting for travelers carrying money, supplies, or livestock. Unlike the dramatized highwaymen of fiction, these criminals were ruthless and opportunistic, striking when and where you least expected. Traveling alone or in small groups was extremely dangerous. Wagons could be ambushed on lonely trails. Riders might be surrounded and held at gunpoint. Livestock could be stolen overnight, leaving families stranded in unfamiliar territory. There was little recourse. Sheriffs were far away, and the law often arrived too late to matter. Some outlaws became legends, names whispered in fear: Jesse James, the Dalton Gang, and Butch Cassidy. But countless others were anonymous, their deeds forgotten except in the private tragedies they left behind. For settlers and travelers, it didn't matter if the attacker was famous or obscure. The danger was real and immediate. Preparedness was key. Travelers carried weapons, traveled in larger groups, and sometimes hired armed escorts. Even then, there were no guarantees. Bandits were clever, adaptable, and often familiar with the land. Ambushes could occur at river crossings, wooded bends, or isolated hills, where escape was nearly impossible. The romantic image of outlaws as charming rogues conceals the reality. Life on the frontier was risky, and death could come from any shadow. Every step outside the town's protective walls required awareness, caution, and the grim understanding that lawlessness extended far beyond any sheriff's reach. In the Wild West, survival meant knowing who to trust in, often trusting no one at all. The Wild West was not empty. The plains, deserts, and forests were home to indigenous peoples who had lived on these lands for generations. For settlers, ignorance or arrogance could turn a simple journey into a deadly encounter. Many native communities were defensive of their territory. They had deep knowledge of the land, its rivers, deserts, and hidden dangers that outsiders lacked. Trespassing, whether intentional or accidental, could provoke hostility. Skirmishes were not rare, and misunderstandings could escalate quickly. Yet, conflict was not the only story. Some travelers found guidance, trading partners, or temporary alliances with local tribes. Indigenous peoples often provided critical knowledge about food sources, waterholes, and safe route skills that could mean the difference between life and death. Still, the reality of westward expansion meant that encounters were often fraught. Settlers sometimes carried weapons for protection, and every approach to unfamiliar territory carried tension. Misjudgments, fear, or aggression could trigger violence instantly. For those unprepared for cultural nuances, the land itself was a stranger, and those who had lived there for generations had the home field advantage. Survival required more than courage. It demanded observation, respect, and humility. The frontier was a shared space, but it was not forgiving. Ignorance or carelessness could make a traveler an enemy, and, in the Wild West, being an enemy was often fatal. The Wild West was home to predators that could turn a quiet day into a fight for survival. Wolves, mountain lions, and bears roamed freely, often invisible until it was too late. These animals were not merely threats, they were skilled hunters, adapted to the same harsh land you were struggling to cross. Encounters were unpredictable. A lone traveler could stumble into a predator's path, or livestock could attract attention, drawing dangerous animals close to campsites. Wolves traveled in packs, coordinating with silent precision. Mountain lions could strike from the shadows. Bears, though often avoiding humans, could be provoked by curiosity or hunger. Even smaller animals posed dangers. Snakes, especially rattlesnakes, and other venomous species, lay hidden under rocks or in tall grass. A single bite could bring excruciating pain, infection, or death without medical attention. Insects, too, carried disease, leaving travelers weak and susceptible to other threats. Animals also disrupted survival in subtler ways. Cattle or horses could be attacked at night, forcing settlers to sleep lightly and guard constantly. Food supplies were vulnerable, and every meal required vigilance to protect against scavengers. The romantic image of cowboys taming the land often omits these hazards. Life alongside wild animals required constant awareness, courage, and sometimes sheer luck. One wrong move, straying from a path, leaving a camp unattended, or underestimating the animal's instinct could have fatal consequences. On the frontier, you were never truly alone. The land teemed with creatures perfectly adapted to survival, and you were the intruder. Life depended on understanding, respect, and always keeping one eye on the wild around you. In the Wild West, a simple accident could become deadly. Cuts, broken bones, or burns that today might be treated easily often led to infection or permanent disability. Medical knowledge was limited, and access to trained doctors was rare hundreds of miles away. Settlers relied on makeshift remedies, herbs, alcohol, and basic surgical procedures performed by whoever had some experience. Bandages were often reused, wounds were cleaned poorly, and sterilization was virtually non-existent. Minor infections could escalate into gangrene. An illness that might be manageable in modern conditions became a death sentence. Common ailments plagued travelers: dysentery, cholera, typhoid, fevers, and respiratory infections. Malnutrition and exhaustion weakened the body, making even a mild disease dangerous. Children were especially vulnerable. A simple cold could turn fatal without proper care. Accidents were frequent. Oxen and horses could trample the unwary tools, could slip, and falls from wagons or cliffs were commonplace. Even a sprained ankle in remote terrain could mean days of immobility, exposure to weather, and risk of further injury. Frontier medicine was brutal in its simplicity. Survival depended not only on avoiding danger, but on improvising treatment, recognizing illness early, and hoping that nature, skill, and luck aligned. On the Wild West, your body was under constant assault from the land, from disease, and from accidents. Every injury was a test, and every day carried the silent risk that one misstep could end your journey permanently. As the seasons turn, the Wild West transforms. Summer's heat gives way to the biting cold of winter, and the landscape becomes almost unrecognizable. Snowdrifts cover the plains, rivers freeze, and temperatures drop to levels that can kill in hours. Settlers faced the constant threat of hypothermia. Without proper clothing, insulation, or heated shelters, even a brief exposure could be deadly. Wool and leather offered some protection, but frostbite on fingers, toes, and exposed skin was common. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, often succumbing to cold faster than able-bodied adults. Travel slowed drastically. Wagons struggled through snow, animals weakened under the strain, and trails became treacherous ice. Rivers that might have been easy to cross in warmer months froze over unpredictably, hiding dangerous currents beneath the ice. One misstep could be fatal. Winter also brought isolation. Supply lines broke down, hunting became more difficult, and illness spread quickly among those trapped in confined spaces. Food could run low, and water sources froze, forcing settlers to melt snow for drinking. Slow, exhausting process. Survival depended on preparation, knowledge, and endurance. Those unprepared for the cold often froze in their tents or cabins, unable to gather firewood or care for their families. Even experienced travelers considered winter crossings among the most dangerous endeavors in the West. The frontier in winter was not picturesque. It was silent, harsh, and unyielding. Survival required constant vigilance, physical strength, and a respect for the lethal power of cold, because the land would not forgive mistakes. Winter did not halt the dangers of the frontier. If anything, it made them more insidious. Snow-covered trails became hunting grounds for bandits who knew the land and preyed on the vulnerable. Travelers moving slowly through snow were easy targets. Wagons stuck in icy ruts, weakened animals, and frostbitten families presented irresistible opportunities for thieves. Robbery in winter wasn't always about gold. It could mean stealing food, clothing, or horses, leaving victims exposed to Deadly conditions. Visibility was often poor. Snowstorms obscured landmarks and trails, making escape or pursuit difficult. Bandits could appear suddenly from whitewashed hills, striking quickly before disappearing into the landscape. The cold amplified every threat. A stolen blanket or horse in freezing temperatures could be a death sentence. Even towns were not completely safe. Outlaws would raid isolated settlements or stage ambushes on trade routes. Patrols were sparse, and the law struggled to respond through snowdrifts and frozen rivers. Self-reliance was essential. Travelers could not count on sheriffs, neighbors, or warnings. Surviving the Wild West in winter demanded more than stamina. It required cunning, observation, and preparation. Every step through the snow was a gamble, and every encounter with another human could turn deadly. The land, the weather, and the lawless few combined to make winter one of the harshest seasons to endure. Survival was never guaranteed. It had to be earned, inch by frozen inch. Gold, the glittering promise of wealth, drew thousands to remote corners of the West. Towns sprang up almost overnight, built of wood, mud, and hope. But these boomtowns were dangerous places, where opportunity and peril existed side by side. Crowds overflowed narrow streets. Saloons, gambling halls, and makeshift shops created a cacophony of noise, smoke, and tension. Disease spread rapidly in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Cholera, typhoid, and fevers claimed lives almost as quickly as bullets. Crime was rampant. Pickpockets, thieves, and swindlers thrived in the chaos. Disputes over claims often escalated into violence, with little hope of intervention. Vigilante justice was common, sometimes swift, sometimes brutal, and often arbitrary. One misstep, disagreeing with a claim holder, challenging a gambler, or speaking out of turn could end in serious injury or death. Basic needs were hard to meet. Food was expensive and of poor quality. Water was contaminated. Lodging was scarce, forcing travelers to sleep in crowded bunkhouses, tents, or even open streets. The harsh reality of frontier survival was never far from the glittering allure of gold. Even successful miners faced danger. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and accidents in mines were constant threats. Cave-ins, gas exposure, and injuries from tools or falls were common. For every fortune made, countless lives were lost or broken. Gold rush towns embodied the Wild West's extremes: wealth and squalor, opportunity and danger, excitement and death. Surviving here required vigilance, skill, and a relentless awareness that danger lurked in every shadow. The Wild West promised freedom, but it also offered temptation in every saloon, gambling hall, and shadowed street. Cards, dice, and the clink of coins drew men and women eager for quick fortune or quick ruin. Gambling was more than entertainment, it was a survival hazard. Money spent on a losing hand could mean no food for the next day. Disputes over cheating, accusations of theft, or drunken confrontations often escalated into violence. A small argument could become a deadly shootout or a savage beating. Alcohol flowed freely, dulling judgment and increasing danger. Drunken travelers stumbled into rivers, fell from wagons, or engaged in fights they would not survive sober. Addiction was common, leaving people weak, sick, and vulnerable to theft or attack. Other vices, prostitution, drugs, and theft added layers of peril. Settlers seeking comfort or distraction often found themselves exploited or endangered. Choices made in desperation or indulgence could have lasting consequences. Even for the cautious, the environment itself seemed designed to test limits. Crowded saloons, isolated gambling tables, and darkened alleys created constant opportunity for disaster. Survival on the frontier wasn't only about facing nature. It was about navigating human danger as well. The Wild West may appear glamorous in stories, but every indulgence carried a cost. Those who failed to control temptation risked more than wealth, they risked life itself. As the sun dips below the horizon, the Wild West transforms. Shadows stretch across the plains, mountains, and forests, turning familiar trails into unfamiliar, dangerous terrain. Traveling after dark was a necessity at times, but it brought risks few modern travelers could imagine. Visibility was nearly zero. Stars and the moon provided little guidance, and fires were too dangerous to leave unattended for fear of attracting predators or bandits. Trails became treacherous rocky paths, hidden ditches, and sudden drops could lead to falls that left travelers injured or dead. Animals were most active at night. Wolves hunted, coyotes prowled, and snakes slithered unseen across campgrounds. And paths, livestock could panic, bolting into the darkness and leaving families stranded or supplies scattered. Even the insects were relentless, biting and buzzing through the night. Bandits and criminals preferred darkness. Ambushes were easier under the cover of night, and the unprepared traveler became an easy target. Isolated campsites could be raided, wagons overturned, and supplies stolen, leaving victims exposed to the cold and the wilderness until morning. Sleep was scarce. Even when resting, one eye often remained open, listening for footsteps, rustling brush, or the howl of predators. Fatigue compounded danger, slowing reflexes and clouding judgment. Traveling at night required experience, caution, and nerves of steel. The West offered no forgiveness for mistakes in darkness. Every step, every mile carried hidden hazards, reminding travelers that survival depended as much on vigilance after sunset as it did during the day. Asterisk. Fire was essential to survival in the Wild West. It provided warmth, light, protection, and a means to cook food. Yet, it was also one of the most unpredictable and deadly forces travelers and settlers faced. A small spark could ignite a catastrophic blaze. Dry grass, wooden cabins, and canvas wagons were highly flammable. A careless campfire could destroy an entire homestead or wagon train in minutes. In towns, fires spread quickly through crowded wooden structures, leaving people trapped or fleeing into smoke-filled streets. Managing fire required constant vigilance. It had to be fed, monitored, and controlled, even in harsh winds or sudden storms. Smoke could obscure vision, attract predators, or draw bandits to your location. Attempting to cook or boil water too close to tents or wagons risked igniting your own supplies. Fire was also a tool for signaling and defense. It could deter predators, mark locations, or provide warmth in freezing conditions. But misjudging its use could be fatal, especially in winter when wood was scarce or in summer when the prairie was tinder dry. For every moment of safety and comfort fire provided, there was an equal risk of destruction. On the frontier, fire demanded respect, skill, and constant attention. Neglect it, and you could lose everything, or even your life. Asterisk. The Wild West was vast, empty, and relentless. Beyond towns and settlements, there were miles of open plains, forests, mountains, and deserts, places where a traveler could go days without seeing another human being. Isolation was not merely lonely, it was a test of the mind. Days stretched into monotony, punctuated by danger. The quiet could be deafening, leaving travelers hyper-aware of every rustle in the brush, every distant howl, every shifting shadow. Anxiety, paranoia, and fear became constant companions. Decisions that might seem simple in civilization, choosing a path, foraging for food, or crossing a river, felt monumental when every choice could mean life or death. Loneliness affected families too. Children and parents alike struggled with boredom, fear, and homesickness. The mental strain of constant vigilance, compounded by hunger, fatigue, and illness, could lead to despair. Some travelers lost hope entirely, abandoning wagons, supplies, or even life itself. Community was scarce. Travelers relied on chance encounters with other settlers, but help was never guaranteed. Miscommunication, misunderstanding, or cultural differences could turn potential allies into threats. Every interaction required judgment, caution, and sometimes diplomacy. Psychological endurance was as crucial as physical stamina. Even those with strong bodies could falter under the relentless mental pressure of the frontier. Isolation was a force of nature in itself, silent, unyielding adversary that could break the strongest minds if left unchecked. Surviving the Wild West demanded not only strength, skill, and courage, but also resilience of spirit. Mental fortitude was as essential as water, food, and shelter, because the land tested the mind as mercilessly as it tested the body. Asterisk. Life on the frontier often demanded relentless labor, and few tasks were as grueling as cattle drives. Herding hundreds or thousands of animals across hundreds of miles of rough terrain was a test of endurance, skill, and patience. Cowboys rose before dawn and rode long into the night, navigating rocky hills, rivers, and open plains. They faced scorching sun, biting winds, sudden storms, and relentless insects. Sleep was scarce. Exhaustion was constant. A single misstep, a horse slipping, a steer bolting, or a poorly timed rope could result in injury or death. Cattle themselves posed danger. Animals were unpredictable, capable of trampling or goring anyone in their path. Stampedes were the nightmare of every cowboy. A chaotic surge of hooves and horns that could flatten wagons, crush men, or scatter livestock over miles. Containing a panicked herd required strength, courage, and quick thinking, with no margin for error. Supplies were limited. Meals were simple, often cold, and barely sufficient to sustain long days of work. Water sources were scarce, forcing men and animals to travel long distances with minimal hydration. Illness, heat stroke, and dehydration were constant threats. Even at the end of a long day, work was not done. Camps had to be set, fires maintained, and cattle secured. Injuries were treated with rudimentary methods, and the cycle began again. Dawn. Cattle drives were not glamorous adventures, they were relentless, punishing, and dangerous. Survival required resilience, endurance, and a profound understanding of both the animals and the land. One wrong decision could turn a day of labor into a lifetime of pain or a death in the dust. Asterisk. Mining promised riches, but it delivered danger at every turn. Miners descended into narrow shafts or dug long trenches in unstable soil, often with little more than a pickaxe, shovel, and lantern. The work was physically exhausting, hazardous, and unforgiving. Collapses were a constant threat. Wooden supports could fail, rocks could shift, and tunnels could cave without warning. Those trapped often had no hope of rescue, as mining towns were remote and equipment scarce. Even minor injuries in the mines could turn deadly due to infection or lack of proper medical care. Water and air were persistent dangers. Flooded tunnels, underground rivers, and sudden rainstorms could fill shafts, drowning workers or cutting off escape. Dust and fumes caused chronic respiratory issues, weakening the lungs and shortening lives. Miners inhaled particles that led to black lung or other debilitating conditions. Beyond physical hazards, life in mining camps was harsh. Food was meager and expensive. Disease spread quickly through crowded tents. Violence over claims, gambling disputes, or alcohol-fueled conflicts that could end in injury or death. Yet miners endured. Some survived decades of brutal work, while others perished in a single day. The promise of wealth was alluring, but the price was often paid in blood, exhaustion, and shattered health. Mining illustrated the frontier's harsh truth. Opportunity and danger were inseparable. Success was rare, and survival required skill, endurance, and unshakable resolve. Asterisk. Traveling by wagon was essential on the frontier, but it was fraught with danger. Wagons were heavy, unwieldy, and often poorly constructed. One wrong turn, a rut in the trail, or a sudden obstacle could tip a wagon, crushing supplies or worse. Passengers, horses and oxen were unpredictable. Startled by predators, storms, or even the wind, animals could bolt, dragging wagons into ditches, rivers, or rocky terrain. Broken axles, snapped wheels, or tangled harnesses were common. Leaving travelers stranded miles from help, rivers posed another threat. Crossing fast-moving water could sweep wagons away in an instant. Ferries were rare, and makeshift rafts were unreliable. Even shallow streams could become deadly during sudden rainstorms or snowmelt, turning safe paths into rushing torrents. Nightfall increased risks. Poor visibility made obstacles harder to see, while fatigue slowed reactions. Campfires could be knocked over, wagons became vulnerable to bandits, and animals were harder to control. Even well-prepared travelers faced mishaps. Weather terrain and simple human error combined to create unpredictable dangers. Survival depended on experience, vigilance, and a deep understanding of both the wagon and the land it traversed. Wagon travel was not an adventure, it was a trial. One miscalculation could mean injury, lost supplies, or death, making every mile a challenge to be respected, not romanticized. Asterisk. Rivers and streams, though lifelines for water and food, were treacherous obstacles for frontier travelers. Crossing them was a constant gamble, with strong currents, hidden rocks, and sudden depth changes threatening life at every step. Wagons were particularly vulnerable. Heavy loads made balance precarious, and animals could panic in the water, dragging passengers or overturning carts. Even a shallow stream could sweep a wagon downstream if the bank was slippery or the current swift. Hypothermia was a serious Cold water sapped strength quickly, and even experienced swimmers struggled to stay afloat in icy rivers. Children, the elderly, or the exhausted were especially at risk, and rescue options were limited. Rivers also concealed hidden hazards, jagged rocks, submerged tree trunks, and sudden drop-offs. Travelers who underestimated the depth or overestimated their strength often paid the ultimate price. Disease was another concern. Contaminated water could cause dysentery or other illnesses, weakening the body and reducing survival chances. Crossing required careful planning, teamwork, and constant vigilance. Even then, nature held the advantage. Many a settler or traveler never reached the other side, their journey cut short by the seemingly innocent force of flowing water in the Wild West. Rivers were not just scenic features, they were formidable adversaries that demanded respect, skill, and humility. Underestimating them was a mistake few survived. The Wild West was not just a land of opportunity, was a land of constant environmental danger. Beyond hunger, disease, and human threats, settlers faced the unpredictable forces of nature. Fires, floods, and other natural disasters could strike without warning, leaving destruction and death in their wake. Prairie fires spread with terrifying speed. Dry grass and wooden buildings acted as tinder, and a single spark, whether from a campfire, lightning strike, or careless human ignite a blaze that consumed homes, crops, and livestock. Smoke choked lungs and eyes, and fleeing offered no guarantee of safety. Floods, too, were relentless. Rivers could rise suddenly from rainstorms or snowmelt, sweeping away bridges, wagons, and entire homesteads. Settlers often lost supplies, animals, and lives to waters they could not control. Other disasters, tornadoes, hailstorms, and landslides, data to the unpredictability. No amount of preparation could fully protect against sudden winds, falling debris, or shifting terrain. The land itself was alive and indifferent, testing humans at every turn. Survival demanded constant vigilance, respect for the environment, and quick thinking. Every natural disaster was a reminder that human strength alone was often insufficient. Life on the frontier required adaptability and acceptance that the land could claim what it pleased in the Wild West. Danger came from every direction, not only from humans and animals, but from the very earth itself. The plains of the Wild West were often unforgiving under the sun. Summer brought relentless heat, and dust storms swept across open lands, turning travel and daily life into a test of endurance. Temperatures could soar above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, baking the ground, wilting crops, and sapping strength. Travelers and settlers suffered from dehydration, sunburn, and heat exhaustion. Water was precious, and finding enough to drink for humans and animals alike could become a desperate struggle. Dust storms added another layer of danger. Winds carried fine particles that choked lungs, stung eyes, and coated clothing and supplies. Visibility dropped to a few feet, making navigation hazardous and leaving travelers vulnerable to accidents, predators, or ambush. Prolonged exposure could lead to respiratory problems, illness, or even death. Animals struggled as well. Horses, cattle, and oxen slowed under heat and suffocation, making travel slower and more exhausting. Crops and food stores could be destroyed, leaving families with hunger and hardship. Even simple activities, cooking, tending animals, or walking, became dangerous in these conditions. Heat and dust were silent adversaries, weakening bodies and minds. Often without warning, surviving the sun and dust required preparation, constant hydration, and the ability to recognize the signs of heatstroke or exhaustion. Those who underestimated the power of the environment risked collapse, injury, or worse. In the Wild West, the land itself was both provider and predator, demanding respect for its extremes and readiness for its harshest conditions. Asterisk. Winter transformed survival into a daily struggle against hunger. Crops failed to grow under snow and frozen soil. Hunting became difficult, and rivers, often a source of fish, froze solid. For settlers and travelers alike, finding enough food to survive was a constant battle. Rations were meager. Families and travelers relied on preserved foods, salted meat, hardtack, dried beans, and whatever could be stored before winter. These provisions were often insufficient, leading to malnutrition, fatigue, and weakened resistance to disease. Animals were both food and labor, but they too suffered in winter. Horses, cattle, and oxen required extra feed and care, yet harsh conditions made grazing scarce. Starving animals could collapse, leaving travelers stranded or settlers unable to plow fields, haul supplies, or hunt effectively. Hunting in winter was dangerous. Deep snow slowed movement, hidden ice patches caused falls, and predators hunted the same game. Every meal was earned through skill, patience, and courage. But even success offered only temporary relief from hunger. Malnutrition had cascading effects. Weak bodies were more susceptible to cold, illness, and injury. Exhaustion reduced alertness, increasing the risk of accidents or attacks. Starvation was silent but relentless, gradually eroding strength and hope. In the Wild West, winter was not just cold, it was a test of endurance, resourcefulness, and sheer willpower. Food was life, scarcity was constant, and failure to prepare or adapt could mean the end of the journey. Asterisk. Winter scarcity made settlements more vulnerable. With food, livestock, and supplies limited, bandits saw opportunity in desperation. Small towns and isolated cabins were prime targets for raids, often carried out under the cover of snow and darkness. Defenses were minimal. Walls were weak, guns were limited, and neighbors were scattered across the frozen landscape. One or two intruders could overpower a household or small group, stealing everything from food to animals. Violence often followed, and those who resisted risked injury or death. Survivors relied on vigilance, lookouts, guard shifts, and barricaded doors were standard precautions. Yet even the most prepared could be caught off guard. Bandits were experienced in winter conditions, tracking footprints, following smoke signals, and anticipating human behavior. Raids were not just about theft, they were psychological. Fear spread quickly through a settlement, leaving families hesitant to leave their homes, hunt, or venture into the snow. The constant threat added stress to already strained communities, weakening morale and making survival even harder. The Wild West was not a land where law guaranteed safety. Even in settled areas, danger was never far. Criminals exploited isolation, weather, and scarcity, turning winter into a season of heightened risk. Survival demanded not only preparedness but also courage, cunning, and a relentless awareness of human, as well as natural threats. Asterisk. Frontier life was not only physically demanding, it was dangerously unsanitary. Camps, whether temporary along trails or permanent settlements, were breeding grounds for disease. Close quarters, poor hygiene, and contaminated water created ideal conditions for illness to spread rapidly. Common diseases included dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and influenza. Even a minor infection could escalate quickly without proper treatment. Children, the elderly, and the already weakened were especially vulnerable. A single sick individual could infect an entire wagon train or cabin, turning survival into a desperate struggle. Animals contributed to the risk. Livestock and pets could carry parasites or diseases, while rodents infested grain stores and tents. Insects, fleas, mosquitoes, and lice spread additional illness, biting travelers and contaminating clothing and bedding. Medical care was limited. Doctors were few, and supplies scarce. Remedies often relied on herbs, alcohol, or makeshift surgeries, with unpredictable results. Prevention, clean water, hand washing, and proper waste disposal was difficult, making camps themselves inherently hazardous. Disease added an invisible threat to the tangible dangers of the frontier. Even with skill, vigilance, and preparation, travelers faced the constant possibility of illness striking at the worst possible moment. Survival depended not only on strength, courage, and knowledge of the land, but also on managing the unseen enemies that spread silently through the camp. In the Wild West, disease was relentless, indiscriminate, and deadly. It reminded all who ventured into the frontier that danger was as much within as without. Asterisk. Guns were a necessity in the Wild West, but they were far from safe. Firearms technology of the time was unreliable, and accidents were common. A misfire could injure the shooter or someone nearby, while poorly maintained weapons could explode or jam at the worst possible moment. Handling firearms required skill, strength, and constant attention. Many newcomers assumed carrying a gun guaranteed safety, but inexperience often turned a tool of defense into a source of danger. Accidental discharges occurred in saloons, campsites, and even while riding horseback, often with fatal consequences. Even experienced cowboys and lawmen faced risks. Powder residue, worn parts, and poorly fitted ammunition made failure likely. In the heat of conflict, a jammed revolver or broken rifle could mean death. Every shot demanded careful aim and steady nerves, as one mistake could trigger injury, death, or unintended collateral damage. Weapons also heightened tension. The presence of guns made disputes more likely to escalate, and even routine tasks, cleaning, reloading, or carrying a firearm required vigilance. Alcohol, fatigue, and inexperience amplified the dangers, turning everyday life into a constant negotiation with lethal tools. In the Wild West, firearms were both protector and threat. Survival depended not only on carrying a weapon, but on knowing how to use it safely under pressure. One careless moment could turn the frontier from a land of opportunity into a graveyard of mistakes. Asterisk. The Wild West was not just a battle against nature and bandits, it was also a place where human conflict could turn deadly in an instant. Settlers, travelers, and prospectors frequently encountered locals whose temper, pride, or desperation could erupt into violence. Misunderstandings were common. A perceived insult, a disputed claim, or a disagreement over resources could escalate quickly. In communities where law enforcement was sparse, disputes were often settled with fists, knives, or guns. Even casual interactions carried risk. Alcohol intensified conflict. Saloons were hotbeds for arguments that could end in serious injury or death. A drunken altercation could spiral out of control, leaving victims with broken bones, gunshot wounds, or worse. Cultural and territorial tensions also played a role. Migrants moving into areas long occupied by others, whether settlers, ranchers, or indigenous peoples, faced hostility. Navigating these encounters required diplomacy, caution, and an acute awareness of social norms and local hierarchies. Even friendly towns could hide danger. Someone seemingly helpful might have hidden motives, such as robbery or betrayal. Trust was a precious commodity, and misjudging a person could have fatal consequences. Survival in the Wild West depended as much on understanding people as the land. Awareness, tact, and respect could save a life, while a single misstep might end it. In this world, humans were often as lethal as the wilderness itself. Securing food on the frontier was a constant necessity, but fishing and hunting carried serious dangers. Rivers teemed with fish, yet swift currents, slippery banks, and hidden underwater hazards made the task treacherous. A single misstep could lead to a broken lemur. Worse, drowning. Hunting presented its own perils. Animals were strong, unpredictable, and often more dangerous than the hunter anticipated. Bears, mountain lions, and even large deer could inflict serious injuries. Wounding an animal without proper skill often provoked an attack rather than yielding food. Weapons added another layer of risk. Rifles and knives were essential tools, yet misfires, slips, or poor aim could cause accidents. Even experienced hunters could be injured by their own equipment or by animals defending themselves. Environmental hazards compounded the dangers. Poisonous plants, snakes, and insects lurked near hunting grounds, while uneven terrain and sudden weather changes threatened travelers. Tracking game often led men far from safe areas, exposing them to the elements, predators, and isolation. Hunting and fishing demanded patience, knowledge, and skill. A successful day meant sustenance, but mistakes could be fatal. The frontier offered no guarantees. Every meal was earned at the cost of vigilance, courage, and respect for the dangers lurking in the wild. In the Wild West, justice was swift, brutal, and often arbitrary. Lawmen were few, poorly trained, and spread thin across vast territories. Many towns relied on self-appointed sheriffs or vigilantes, creating a system where survival sometimes depended more on cunning than morality. A dispute over property, money, or a personal slight could escalate into lethal punishment. Trials were rare, evidence was flimsy, and personal grudges often dictated outcomes. Being accused or mistaken for a criminal could lead to imprisonment, public humiliation, or even execution without fair consideration. Vigilante groups operated outside official law, taking matters into their own hands. While intended to protect communities, their methods were harsh and unforgiving. One misstep or wrong accusation could lead to beatings, lynchings, or banishment. Trusting strangers, or even neighbors, was always risky. Even law-abiding citizens faced danger. Traveling through areas with weak enforcement meant exposure to both criminals and overzealous enforcers. The line between right and wrong was often blurred, and those unfamiliar with local customs or politics risked serious consequences. Survival required awareness, diplomacy, and sometimes avoidance. Understanding local laws, personalities, and power dynamics could mean the difference between safety and a fatal mistake. In the Wild West, justice was rarely fair, and the consequences for error were often irreversible. Asterisk. The Wild West was a land of extremes. Sun-scorched plains, sudden storms, torrential rain, and snowdrifts made survival a constant battle against the elements. Exposure to extreme weather could quickly turn a routine day into a life or death struggle. Summer heat was merciless. Temperatures soaring above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, caused dehydration, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Travelers without sufficient water or shade risked collapsing in the open, vulnerable to both wildlife and human threats. Winter brought bitter cold, snow, and ice. Hypothermia set in rapidly, and frostbite could claim fingers, toes, or even entire lives. Shelters were rudimentary, and fires were essential yet risky. Too little warmth meant freezing. Too much could start a destructive blaze. Storms added unpredictability. Tornadoes, hail, lightning, and sudden floods struck without warning. Open plains offered little protection, and dense forests could trap travelers under falling branches or slippery terrain. Even seasoned settlers struggled to predict and withstand these hazards. Survival depended on preparation, knowledge of the terrain, and constant vigilance. Clothing, shelter, and timing of travel were crucial, but luck often played a decisive role. The land could be as lethal as any predator, indifferent to human plans or perseverance. In the Wild West, the weather was both a silent enemy and an ever-present reminder that life here demanded respect, resilience, and relentless awareness of nature's power. Asterisk. Life on the frontier was relentless, not just physically but mentally. Danger was omnipresent: wild animals, bandits, harsh weather, disease, and accidents created a world where vigilance was never optional. Over time, this constant threat took a heavy toll on the mind. Anxiety and fear were daily companions. Every rustle in the brush, every shadow on a trail, and every distant sound could signal peril. Travelers and settlers lived in a heightened state of alert, where exhaustion and hyper-awareness coexisted. Mistakes were costly, and the mental strain of perpetual caution wore down even the strongest. Isolation amplified the psychological burden. Long stretches without human contact bred loneliness, depression, and despair. Families and groups faced conflict, as stress and scarcity heightened tempers and eroded patience. Children, accustomed to constant danger, often experienced fear and trauma beyond their years. The threat of violence was ever present. One argument, one misjudged gesture, or one wrong word could escalate into deadly consequences. Settlers and travelers had to navigate not only the wilderness, but the unpredictable nature of human behavior. Mental endurance became as vital as physical stamina. Those who failed to manage stress, fear, and despair often made fatal errors. Even successful individuals carried scars both visible and invisible from the relentless pressure of frontier life. In the Wild West, survival demanded not only courage and skill, but also resilience of mind. The psychological cost of constant danger was invisible but profound, shaping every decision, every action, and every chance of making it through another day. After all the hardships, dangers, and struggles of the Wild West, one lesson stands clear: no human skill or courage could ever fully conquer nature. The land was vast, indifferent, and unforgiving. Survival was not guaranteed. It was earned, inch by painstaking inch. Rivers, storms, predators, and disease did not discriminate. Bandits, harsh winters, scorching summers, and scarcity of food were constant tests, yet none were as relentless as the natural world itself. Even the strongest, most experienced settlers found themselves humbled before the elements. The Wild West demanded respect. Every decision from choosing a campsite to rationing food required knowledge, foresight, and humility. Ignoring the rules of the land often led to injury, illness, or death. Survival was a delicate balance between human ingenuity and the unyielding power of nature. Romantic images of cowboys riding freely across the plains or towns, bustling with gold-fueled excitement, obscured the harsh truth. For most, the frontier was a battlefield against forces far beyond human control. Only those who recognized their limits, adapted quickly, and respected the land could hope to endure. In the end, the Wild West reminds us of a timeless reality. The earth and its forces are indifferent to human ambition. Life is fragile, and survival is never a certainty. It's a lesson in humility, endurance, and respect. Now, imagine you have survived one full day in the Wild West. The sun has set. The wind howls across the plains, and you finally pause to take stock of what remains. Your clothes are torn and soiled, your body aches from endless exertion, and your mind carries the weight of constant vigilance. Perhaps you caught a fish, managed a few bites of preserved food, or avoided a dangerous encounter. But each victory was narrow, fragile, and hard-won. Every choice, every movement, demanded awareness, skill, and luck. A single lapse could have ended the day in disaster. As night falls, you realize that survival is not about heroism, it is about endurance, adaptability, and respect for forces beyond your control. You have glimpsed the truth behind the romantic images. The Wild West is as beautiful as it is brutal, as full of opportunity as it is unforgiving. This imagined day, whether survived or not, teaches a vital lesson. The frontier was a world that demanded everything from those who entered it. Nature, human conflict, disease, and sheer chance created a reality far harsher than any storybook could convey. As you close your eyes, consider the countless souls who faced these trials daily. Most did not survive even a single day. For those who did, survival was not a triumph, it was a testament to endurance, courage, and an unwavering will to continue against impossible odds. In the quiet that follows, one truth remains clear: the Wild West was never a land for the unprepared, the naive, or the weak. To imagine living there is to understand just how fragile life could be, and why so few could ever truly endure its relentless challenges. Imagine a land bathed in golden sunlight, stretching endlessly into the horizon. Cowboys ride across open plains, their silhouettes etched against the sky. The doors of saloons swing open to reveal laughter, music, and the occasional clink of glasses. Dust swirls in the wind, carrying the scent of leather, horses, and possibility. It's a vision the world has long romanticized, the Wild West, a place of freedom, adventure, and opportunity. Here, men and women are said to chase fortunes, carve out destinies, and live lives of rugged heroism. But pause for a moment. Behind this alluring imagery lies a harsher reality. The open plains are unforgiving. The saloons hide more than cheer. They conceal danger, disease, and conflict. The freedom often came with a price few were prepared to pay. Tonight, we step beyond the romanticized postcards of cowboys and sunsets. Tonight, we journey into the truth of the Wild West, and we ask ourselves a chilling question: could you survive even a single day here? Every chapter of this story will peel back the layers of myth, revealing a world where survival demanded more than courage. It demanded vigilance, resilience, and a deep respect for the unforgiving land. Now, imagine you wake up one morning, not in your familiar home, but in the heart of the Wild West. The sun has barely risen, and the air smells of dust, leather, and wood smoke. A distant river gurgles quietly, and somewhere far off, the faint clatter of hooves breaks the stillness. This is your world for the day. Every decision, every step, every glance matters. Will you make it until nightfall, or will the unforgiving land claim you before sunset? You reach for food, but the rations are sparse. You plan your route, but the trails are rough, unpredictable, and filled with unseen hazards. Every noise, every rustle of grass, every call of an animal carries potential danger in this place. Nothing is guaranteed. Water may be scarce. Wildlife can be deadly. Bandits or hostile encounters are always a possibility. Even a simple misstep, a broken branch, a misjudged river crossing, a startled horse can have life or death consequences. And yet, for all the peril, the land calls to you. The horizon stretches endlessly, the skies blaze with color at dawn, and the sense of raw, untamed possibility hums beneath the danger. One day, one chance. That is all the frontier grants. Every hour, every choice, every breath is a test. The Wild West is a land that does not forgive mistakes, but it teaches lessons no other place can. Pause. Faint sound of wind and distant hooves to create tension tonight. We follow the footsteps of those who lived here, those who struggled and often failed to survive. You may walk alongside them, feeling the weight of a day in the wild, where every moment is a delicate balance between life and death.